He was divorced, broke, and mocked by everyone, including his own brother. For daring to join the army at 40, no one believed he'd make it past the first week of training. Not the recruiters, not the instructors, not even himself. But what he did during qualifications silenced every doubt. From sleepless nights to carrying fallen recruits, he didn't just survive, he became the one others looked to. This isn't a story about age, it's about quiet grit, forgotten strength, and a man who refused to give up when the world told him he was too late. What happened at the rope wall changed everything. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The envelope was plain, white. No markings except his name typed across the center and the return address of a law firm he had come to recognize over the past 6 months. It sat on the table like it had been waiting, quietly absorbing the quiet of the apartment. Daniel didn't open it right away. He knew what was inside. He'd known since the last mediation, when the attorney on the other end didn't bother hiding the smirk as he slid the papers forward. Still, seeing it there in final form, already delivered, made it real in a way nothing else had. He set down the coffee mug he hadn't yet taken a sip from. The sun hadn't fully risen. Thin lines of pale orange light crept between the blinds, casting weak shadows across the laminate floor. The silence felt heavier than usual. He sat at the kitchen table and ran his fingers under the flap of the envelope. The paper sliced his skin, a shallow cut, but it stung. Fitting, he thought. A small pain to go with the rest. Inside the papers were crisp, coldly professional. 4 pages, 2 signatures, hers and his. A final declaration of what was no longer shared, no custody. His daughter was 16 and old enough, the judge said, to decide on her own where she wanted to live. She'd chosen her mother's house, a decision delivered softly in a text message, with no punctuation and no warmth. He hadn't blamed her, not really. Her life was there, her room, her friends, the familiar softness of a life untouched by the things that had worn him down. The apartment was temporary, month-to-month lease, 1 bedroom barely furnished. The couch had come from his sister's garage, the mattress was still on the floor, and most of the dishes were plastic. He had sold the house, or rather, she had. He'd signed the paperwork while sitting in the backseat of his truck. She got the proceeds. She said it was fair. She had the child, after all. He turned the last page over, expecting something more, some clause he'd missed. But there was nothing, just a small stamp from the county clerk and the date it had been processed. The marriage had lasted 17 years. The divorce was complete in just under 4 months. He folded the papers back along their original creases and placed them on the edge of the table. For a moment, he just stared at them, not angry, not surprised, just tired. The sound of traffic from the street below drifted through the cracked window. A delivery truck backing up, someone's dog barking. Life outside continued without him, unaware or unconcerned. He stood and walked to the kitchen sink, rinsed his hands, and watched the water swirl down the drain. The cut on his finger was still bleeding lightly, a thin red line across pale skin. He thought about calling someone, his brother maybe, but the last conversation had ended with a half-hearted, "Let's catch up soon," which neither of them had followed through on. Friends had drifted away over the years, mostly her friends, really, couples that now sent 1 invitation instead of 2. He hadn't gone to the last wedding, or the last birthday. He sat back down and opened his laptop. The login screen reflected, his face older than he remembered, more tired around the eyes. He clicked the browser and opened a new tab. The military site was still saved in his bookmarks from the night, months ago, when he couldn't sleep. He'd read through it back then, with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. Now, it felt like something solid, something structured, something that didn't ask questions about what he had failed to become. The enlistment requirements were still there. Unchanged, age limit 42. He was 40, just barely. Health requirements, background check, basic training, the whole list. He scrolled down, not reading, just watching the words move. His finger hovered over the contact form. Then he clicked it. The cursor blinked in the message box. He typed slowly, "I'm 40, no prior service, just finalized a divorce. Looking to start something new." He stared at the message for a long time before hitting send. The form disappeared, replaced by a thank you notice and a promise that someone would be in touch. He sat back in his chair and looked out the window. The sun was higher now, the street was busier. Somewhere people were starting their normal days. His, finally, had ended. Or maybe it had just begun. The days that followed passed without distinction. He didn't mark the calendar. He didn't write anything down. Mornings blurred into evenings without interruption, each one shaped by the same patterns. He would wake up before the sun, not because of an alarm, but because his body refused to let him sleep past 5. He would lie in bed for a while, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional thud of footsteps from the neighbor above. Sometimes a delivery truck passed outside. Sometimes nothing passed at all. There were no missed calls on his phone, no new texts, no emails. The only messages came from companies trying to sell him something: insurance, pillows, meal kits. He'd scroll through them out of habit, deleting each one without really reading. He hadn't told anyone what he was thinking about doing, not his brother, not the few friends who still existed somewhere in the outer edges of his life. He wasn't sure it mattered. The people who used to be part of his daily routine had slowly faded in the years before the divorce. He hadn't noticed it happening. It was only now, in the echo of the apartment, that the absence felt sharp. The apartment itself was almost aggressively quiet, the kind of quiet that made small sounds seem louder than they should be. A faucet drip felt like a metronome. Fridge humming, on and off, broke the silence in bursts. The floor creaked when he shifted in the old chair by the kitchen table. On some days, he'd turn on the television just to fill the space with something news anchors. Cooking shows late night, reruns, but the noise only reminded him that no one was listening with him. Dinner was simple, the same more often than not. A can of beans heated in a pot on the stove. Occasionally, he'd add rice or toast if he remembered to buy it. There were frozen meals in the back of the freezer, but those were for days when even boiling water felt like too much effort. He didn't eat out anymore. Restaurants were too quiet when you sat alone, and even the noise of other people talking had started to feel intrusive. It was easier to eat, facing the small window, watching the streetlights flicker on as the sun disappeared behind the nearby buildings. Sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he'd go for a walk, usually late, around 10 or 11, when most people had already settled in. He'd pass houses with blue flickers of television light behind curtains. Cars parked neatly in driveways, porch lights glowing. He didn't know the people who lived in them. He didn't need to. Their lives had rhythm, shape, something his no longer had. A few times he walked past the dog that barked 2 streets over. It always barked at the same time, every night, as if it were trying to remind someone that it was still there. He thought about reaching out to his daughter. He drafted messages and then deleted them. Not because he didn't want to talk, but because he didn't want to be a burden. Her world was likely full of school and friends and routines that had nothing to do with him anymore. It had been weeks since they last spoke, and the last thing she had said was that she needed space. He was giving it to her, even if it carved out space in him too. One night, he pulled a box down from the top shelf of the bedroom closet. It had been taped shut since the move. Inside were photos, loose papers, a few cards, and a medal from a high school track meet he had forgotten he ever won. He sifted through it slowly, holding each item like it might dissolve. A photo of their first apartment, a birthday card from his daughter when she was 6. Her handwriting was large and uneven. "You are the best dad," it read. He folded the card and placed it back inside. The next morning, he opened his laptop again. No response from the military recruiter yet, just the confirmation email from 2 days ago. He read it again. There was something in the formality of it that made it feel real, like someone, somewhere, had acknowledged that he was still capable of beginning something. He ate his breakfast in another can, this time cold. Outside, the same dog barked. Somewhere in the building, a shower turned on, and in the space between the noise, the silence pressed in, not cruelly, but completely. The bar was half full, lit mostly by muted screens and the neon buzz of a beer sign near the window. It wasn't the kind of place where anyone asked questions. People came here after work, or after something harder than work, to let the noise blur the edges a little. Daniel hadn't been here in a long time, maybe a year, maybe more, but the stools were still the same. The music still soft enough not to matter, and his brother still sat in the corner booth, like he always had, back against the wall, beer in hand. Eyes tracking every person who walked through the door. They talked for a while about nothing. The game on TV, a neighbor from high school who'd just gotten arrested, how cold the mornings were getting, the usual filler. Daniel let it carry them for a while. He wasn't sure how to bring it up. It wasn't something you could just drop into a conversation between nachos and another round when it finally slipped out. It came almost as a joke. "Been thinking about the army," he said, staring into his glass. His voice barely rose above the hum of the room. His brother paused mid-sip and set his drink down harder than he meant to. "The army," he blinked. Then a grin spread across his face, too fast, too wide. "You..." Daniel nodded slowly, not meeting his brother's eyes. "You're 40, his brother said, letting the words settle in like a punchline. "I mean, no offense, but you get winded walking up to flights of stairs." Daniel didn't respond. He just kept his hands on the glass, fingers wrapping around the condensation like it might give him something solid to hold on to. His brother chuckled. Again, less harsh this time, but still sharp around the edges. "You're serious? I already filled out the form," Daniel said. "Recruiter's supposed to call next week." The grin faded, just a little. His brother leaned back against the booth cushion and exhaled. "Man, I mean, it's just why." Daniel shrugged. "Because I need to do something that matters. Something that doesn't involve just existing." His brother shook his head slowly, not out of judgment, but confusion. "That's a young man's game, Dan. You got guys in there who just graduated high school. They bounce back. They bend you." He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he picked up his beer again and took another long sip. Daniel looked up, meeting his brother's eyes now. "I've got nothing tying me down anymore. No house, no family left in my care, just me. If I'm ever going to do something hard, something that pushes back, now's the time." There was a pause, the kind that made the silence louder than any noise in the bar. His brother's mouth opened, then closed again. The grin was gone. "You really think they'll take you?" "They might not, but I'm going to try." His brother ran a hand through his hair, the way he did when he didn't know how to respond. "What are you looking for, man? Discipline? A paycheck? A mission? Purpose?" Daniel said, without hesitation. That word landed with weight. His brother leaned forward again, elbows on the table, both hands around the bottle now. "You sure it's not just a midlife thing, trying to prove you've still got something left?" "Maybe," Daniel said, "but I'd rather try and fail than keep sitting in that apartment wondering if the rest of my life already passed me." His brother let out a long breath and stared at the label on his beer. "You know, Mom would have said, 'You're crazy.' She said that about a lot of things." Another pause. Then his brother chuckled again, but it was different this time, more tired than amused. "Well, hell, if you do it, you better finish it. I don't want to read some article about a guy who sprained his back on day 2 and came home early." Daniel smiled, just barely. "Then I won't come back early." The rest of the night passed slowly. They talked a little more, laughed about old things, watched the game until it ended. But when they left the bar and stepped out into the cold air, his brother clapped a hand on his shoulder and said only one thing: "If you're going to do it, go all in." Daniel nodded. "I will." The recruiting office sat between a pawn shop and a vape store, the kind of strip mall spot you'd pass 100 times without noticing. Daniel parked 2 spaces from the door and sat in his truck for a few minutes before going in. The engine ticked in the silence, cooling down. He checked his reflection in the mirror. No one was watching, but he straightened his collar anyway. Inside, the air was colder than expected. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Posters lined the walls, smiling faces in uniform, helicopters mid-flight, slogans about pride and potential. A flag stood in the corner beside a framed photo of a group graduation. The floor tiles squeaked faintly under his boots as he stepped. Toward the reception desk, a young man in a polo shirt looked up from behind a computer. "You here for information?" Daniel nodded. "I filled out a form online, said I should come in for a meeting." The man stood and gestured toward a row of chairs against the wall. "Sergeant Myers will be right with you." Daniel sat down. The chair creaked beneath his weight. He looked around. 2 other people waited, one maybe 19, fidgeting with his phone, the other barely out of high school, holding a folder full of documents and glancing nervously at the clock. 10 minutes passed. Then a door opened and a woman in camo stepped out. Her eyes swept the waiting area, before locking on to Daniel Delgado. He stood. "Yeah, that's me. Come on back." Her office was small: 2 chairs, a desk, a monitor, a corkboard with pinned photos. She motioned for him to sit, then took the chair opposite. She didn't say anything at first, just opened a file, glanced at the screen, and then turned her attention to him fully. She looked him over once, not unkindly, not judgmentally, just clearly taking it in. "You're 40, she asked, without looking down again. "Just turned. You have any prior service?" "No, ma'am. Medical conditions. Injuries. Nothing serious." She tapped a few keys, then leaned back. "You sure about this?" "I've thought about it for a while. Most of the people we see come in right after high school, 18, 19. You're more than twice their age. This isn't going to be a weekend challenge, it's basic training. Combat prep, long hours, rough days, I know." She looked at him a little longer. "Why now?" "Because I need to do something different. Something that requires me to show up and give more than what I've been giving." She didn't nod, didn't smile. Just studied his face like she was measuring something deeper than just height and weight. "You understand you'll need to pass the physical fitness test, right? That's not just jogging a mile, push-ups, sit-ups, timed runs. There's a standard, and it's not adjusted because you're older." "I'm not asking for adjustments," he said. "You're not going to have a lot in common with your unit. You'll be the one getting called sir because they think you're staff. I can live with that." Another pause. She leaned forward now, elbows on the desk. "You got kids? One daughter, 17. She okay with this?" "I don't think she understands it yet. Most people don't." She tapped on the keyboard again. "We'll need to run your medical records. Background check. If that clears, you'll start prepping for MEPS. You'll need to be honest about anything that could come up. Injuries, medications, anything." "I will." She finally smiled, though it was more thoughtful than encouraging. "You're not the first 40-year-old I've seen walk through this door, but I won't Litzrare. Most don't make it past the first 2 weeks of training. Body gives out, or the mind does." Daniel looked down at his hands. "Then I guess I'll have to prove I'm not most people." She nodded slowly. "All right, Delgado, let's see what you've got." The clinic was quiet in that sterile, humming way that made Daniel feel like he didn't belong, the kind of place that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. He sat on the edge of the examination table, the paper crinkling under him. Each time he shifted, a nurse had just taken his blood pressure and written something quickly on the clipboard before disappearing without a word. Now he waited. On the wall, a faded poster listed the signs of heat stroke. Opposite that, a chart of the human muscular system, every part neatly labeled in small print. He stared at it without really reading. His palms rested on his knees. The paper gown was too short. A knock at the door, then a man in scrubs, thin and fast-moving, entered with the air of someone 10 patients behind schedule. "Mr. Delgado?" Daniel nodded. 40 years old, no prior service, applying for enlistment. "That right?" "Yes, sir." The man skimmed the clipboard. "Any chronic conditions? High blood pressure? Joint pain? Diabetes?" "No." "As sure as I can be." The physician pulled on gloves and began a quick examination. Eyes, ears, reflexes. "You're older than most of our applicants," he said. Not unkindly, just as fact. "But we've seen worse. Had a guy come through at 41, took him 3 tries, but he passed. Didn't last long in training, but technically, he made it." Daniel didn't respond. He wasn't sure what was expected of him. "Still working?" "Part-time at a warehouse. Nights, keeps the bills paid." "Smoker?" "No drugs? Alcohol?" "No." He made another mark on the clipboard. "You take care of yourself. I try." The doctor motioned to the treadmill along the wall. "All right. We're going to run a stress test. Standard for your age. I need to monitor your heart rate, blood oxygen, and how you handle increasing resistance." Daniel changed into the workout clothes they'd provide, a stiff cotton shirt, shorts that didn't quite fit right, and stepped onto the machine. The nurse returned, affixing electrodes to his chest and a cuff around his arm. She was young, probably in her early 20s. Didn't say much, just worked quietly. Her brow furrowed like she didn't want to be the one who had to deliver any bad news. When the machine started, the belt moved slowly. A warm-up pace. Daniel focused on keeping his steps even. The room was silent, except for the rhythm of his feet and the soft beeping of the monitor. After 3 minutes, the speed increased. "You doing all right?" the nurse asked. "Yeah." 5 minutes in, the incline adjusted. His calves began to burn. The shirt clung to his back with sweat. He gritted his teeth and kept moving. 7 minutes. Breathing heavier now, legs pumping. He imagined the smirk on his brother's face, the raised eyebrows of Sergeant Myers. He imagined people already betting on how far he'd get. "Almost there," the nurse said, watching the monitor. The doctor observed quietly from behind the screen. Occasionally, he typed something, but his expression gave nothing away. 10 minutes. Daniel's breath came in gasps now. He blinked sweat from his eyes. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. "All right," the nurse said finally. "You can stop." He stepped off, chest rising and falling, body aching in ways that were familiar but long forgotten. The nurse removed the electrodes gently and handed him a towel. The doctor walked over, glancing at the screen one last time. "You've got good cardiac endurance," he said. "Better than some of the 20-year-olds we see. Blood pressure's a little high under exertion, but not disqualifying. I'll clear you for the next phase." Daniel wiped his face, heart still hammering in his chest. "What's next?" "MEPS appointment. They'll do a full workup. Psychological, physical, background check." This was just the warm-up. The nurse handed him a folder. Inside were papers, signatures, dates. Another formality on the road ahead. As he left the clinic, the sun felt too bright. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, adjusting to the light, the air, the feeling in his legs. Something had started now, slowly, quietly, and despite the aches in his back and the sweat on his collar, he kept walking, one foot in front of the other. The first morning started before the sun even hinted at rising. The lights in the barracks snapped on with a blinding force that felt like punishment. Voices shouted before Daniel could fully open his eyes. His body responded slower than he wanted. Knees stiff, shoulders already aching from a night on a thin mattress, surrounded by 20-year-olds who slept like they had nothing to worry about. He fumbled into his uniform, moving on instinct more than clarity. Outside, the air was cold and thick with fog. The gravel crunched beneath boots as 100 recruits scrambled into formation. Names were barked, rules were repeated, and then the running began. Daniel wasn't the fastest. That was clear from the first lap. His strides were longer, heavier. The younger men and women around him moved like rubber bands, snapping forward with ease. He focused on his breathing, ignored the tightness in his calves, and kept moving. A few recruits ahead of him looked back with smirks, but no one said anything. Not yet. Later, they moved to the field, open ground, made of mud, gravel, and regret. The drill instructor stood like a statue with a voice made of steel. His shouts cut the air in sharp directions, each command louder than the last. Push. Position. Now. Daniel dropped into the mud, palms sinking into the cold earth. The count began. 1. The mud seeped through his sleeves. His arms trembled by the 20th rep. By 30, his elbows burned. Some recruits collapsed, others slowed. "Don't you dare stop. Not until I say." He didn't stop. A younger man to his left let out a sharp breath and rolled onto his side. The drill instructor was there in seconds, shouting into his face. "Quit on the first day. You think this is supposed to feel good? Get up." Daniel didn't look. He just kept lowering himself into the mud, rising again, counting in his head when his voice failed him. By the time they were allowed to stand, his uniform was soaked, his knuckles scraped, and his breath uneven. But he stood. And when the next command came, he moved without hesitation. They marched for miles, carried sandbags, climbed rope walls, slick with frost. The instructors barked orders so fast that Daniel stopped trying to process them as words. They were sounds. To move to, sweat to, bleed for. One recruit vomited by noon. Another twisted his ankle and was sent off for evaluation. Daniel drank water, adjusted his posture, and kept going. When the ice baths came at the end of the day, he thought it might be the breaking point. Stripped down, lowered into the metal container, the water hit like a slap across the chest. His body recoiled, legs kicking, lungs seizing. But he stayed in, gripping the edge of the tub, eyes fixed on the sky above. He counted seconds. 60, 90. He lost track after that. Back in the barracks, no one talked much. Some wrote letters. Some just stared at the ceiling. Daniel sat on his bunk towel. wrapped around his shoulders, hands trembling slightly from the cold. He didn't think about quitting. He didn't think about home. He thought about tomorrow and how he'd have to do it all again. Lights went out before 2,100 hours. A soft cough echoed from a bunk nearby. Someone whispered a prayer under their breath. Daniel lay on his back, muscles aching in ways he hadn't felt in decades. He was behind the others in time, in strength, in recovery. That much was obvious. But as he drifted into uneasy sleep, one fact anchored him. He was still there. He hadn't stopped, and he wouldn't. They called him Old Man before they ever learned his name. It wasn't mean-spirited, not exactly, just the kind of nickname that stuck quickly in places like this, where identities were flattened and routines were dictated to the second. Came from the youngest one, Private Kellerman, 19, barely out of high school, freckles still across his face and a baby-smooth jawline that hadn't seen more than a few weeks of shaving. Kellerman had been appointed squad leader during the first week, mostly because he'd scored highest on the initial PT test and could shout instructions without hesitation. The drill instructors liked that. Confidence, loud lungs, a willingness to point and order. Daniel was assigned to Kellerman's squad along with 7 others, and from the first formation, the dynamic was clear. Kellerman barked commands with a practiced edge, pacing back and forth with his chest puffed slightly forward. His eyes often found Daniel, especially when the group didn't move fast enough, or precisely enough. "You with us, old man," he'd call out, half joking. "Or are you gonna need a walker for this next lap?" The others laughed, not cruelly, some out of tension, some because they didn't know what else to do. Daniel never responded. He didn't smile, didn't glare, just kept his face neutral and his focus forward. He had nothing to prove to a teenager whose voice still cracked when he was tired. But Kellerman kept testing him. Subtle things, extra laps on the track, assigning Daniel the heaviest packs during gear drills, making him lead fireteam rotations, even when the instructors hadn't asked for it. To the others, it looked like initiative. To Daniel, it looked like challenge. One afternoon, during navigation exercises in the training woods, the squad took a wrong turn. They were supposed to mark 2 coordinates in return before sundown. Kellerman insisted on one path. Daniel hesitated. "That trail leads us toward the creek bend," Daniel said. "We'll end up on the wrong side of the fence line." Kellerman rolled his eyes. "You sure about that? I used to do land surveys. Terrain dips left there. Water always follows the lowest point." There was a pause. No one else said anything. Kellerman huffed and pointed down the alternate trail. But 20 minutes later, they hit the fence, just like Daniel had warned. The group backtracked, losing precious time. They returned late, out of breath, and covered in burrs. The instructor docked them points and made them run punishment drills while the sun dipped low behind the trees. Afterward, while they were catching their breath, Kellerman walked over to Daniel. He didn't say thank you, just looked at him for a long second and then asked, "How'd you know about the fence?" Daniel wiped sweat from his brow. "Because I've been wrong before. Enough times to recognize when it's about to happen." Again, from that point on, things shifted. Not immediately, not openly. Kellerman still called him Old Man in front of the others, but it came with less edge, less smirk. During obstacle training, he started asking Daniel for second opinions on how to split the team. During downtime, he sat nearby instead of across the room. One evening, while waiting for lights out, Kellerman wandered over to Daniel's bunk. No one else was paying attention. "My dad's your age," he said, quietly. Daniel nodded, but didn't reply. "He left when I was 12. Was silence between them, heavy and oddly still. Daniel didn't ask any questions. Kellerman shifted his weight. "Just figured, you don't talk much, but when you do, people listen." Daniel shrugged. "Talking's easy. Being right takes more effort." Kellerman smiled at that, a real one. Then he walked away. The next morning, when the squad assembled, at dawn, Kellerman gave out assignments like usual. But when he got to Daniel, he didn't use the nickname. Just, "Delgado, you're on point today." And nothing else. Mail call always came after chow, usually around the time the sun started to pull long shadows across the yard. Recruits would line up in anticipation, boots scuffing the dirt, eyes flicking toward the drill sergeant who held the clipboard like a prize list. It was one of the few moments in the day not filled with orders or sweat. A small break in the routine where voices softened and hearts leaned, just slightly, toward home. "Martinez," the sergeant called, tossing a padded envelope across the yard. Martinez caught it one-handed and grinned. "Thompson," 2 letters. "Riley." A box dot the pile on the table slowly shrank as name after name was called. Packages of snacks, notes scrawled in quick loops on scented paper, little reminders from the outside world that someone was thinking of them. Pictures of girlfriends, drawings from nieces and nephews, newspaper clippings, stickers, postcards. Daniel stood in the middle of the line, expression neutral, arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't expecting anything. He hadn't put his hopes in this ritual, but still, something stirred just beneath the surface. Each time the clipboard was flipped and another name wasn't his. Jeffers. 1 letter, 1 package. Lee Nguyen. The names rolled on. Daniel kept still. He had filled out the contact forms like everyone else during processing. Listed his daughter, his brother, even an old friend he hadn't spoken to since the divorce. He doubted any of them had written it down. Life moves quickly for some people and slowly for others. He had learned that the hard way. The final name was called. The box was passed. The drill sergeant slapped the clipboard against his thigh and turned to leave. Just like that, the mail was done. Recruits peeled off in every direction, some reading aloud, others holding the envelopes like fragile things. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, then walked back toward the barracks alone. Inside, a few were already digging into their packages. Candy bars smuggled under socks, notes tucked into Ziplocs. Laughter bounced off the walls as someone read a letter from a cousin who thought basic training was a summer camp. Martinez offered around a handful of trail mix. Riley was already halfway through a bag of jerky. Daniel sat on his bunk, unlacing his boots. He reached for the water bottle on the floor beside him, took a slow sip, and said nothing. Private Slater, a skinny kid from North Carolina, wandered over and sat across from him. He held a granola bar still in its wrapper, partially opened. "You want it?" he asked. Daniel looked up, surprised. "You sure?" "Got 2, Slater said, "for my aunt. She sends care packages like she's feeding a small army." Daniel hesitated, then reached out. "Thanks." Slater nodded and didn't say anything else. He just sat there for a while, chewing his own bar, watching the others. Daniel unwrapped the granola slowly. The wrapper crinkled loudly in the quiet room. It wasn't much, just oats and chocolate chips pressed into a rectangle, but it tasted like something made by hand. He took small bites, letting each one sit on his tongue for a few seconds longer than necessary. No one else said anything about the empty pile with his name not on it. No one had to. He wasn't the only one who didn't get mail, just the only one who never seemed to expect it. Later that night, when the lights went out and the room settled into breathing and creaking bunks, Daniel lay awake staring at the ceiling. Somewhere across the building, someone laughed in their sleep. Somewhere outside, a bugle played taps low and distant. He thought of his daughter, wondering if she even knew how long he'd been gone, wondering if she remembered his handwriting. Then he thought about Slater and the quiet kindness of an unasked-for granola bar. And for the first time in days, his chest didn't feel quite as hollow. Guard shift wasn't something most recruits volunteered for. It meant less sleep, more standing, and the constant weight of responsibility that lingered even when nothing happened. But Daniel asked for it on the first rotation, and then again. The next night, by the end of the week, it became expected, his name already penciled in on the duty sheet before he even stepped forward. The others didn't question it. Some were grateful not to be woken up. Others just assumed it was another old man quirk, like how he lined up his boots at exactly the same angle every night, or how he folded his blanket tighter than regulation required. A few whispered theories floated around. He couldn't sleep, he liked the quiet, maybe he had some background in security. Daniel never offered an explanation. The truth was simpler. Night watch gave him space. At 0200 hours, the world moved. Differently, the barracks, usually filled with laughter, grumbling, and the scuff of boots, became a place of slow breathing and twitching dreams. The hallway lights were dimmed to a soft yellow. Outside, the air was colder, cleaner, with fog settling low around the training field. Stars blinked through the gaps in the cloud cover, and sometimes, if the wind was quiet enough, you could hear the distant hum of trucks moving supplies to another part of the base. Daniel stood at the entrance to the building, rifle slung across his chest, boots firmly planted, eyes scanning even when there was nothing to see. His mind wandered, but never far. He liked the repetition of it, checking doors, logging the hour, walking the same short path every 15 minutes. It gave shape to time in a place where days blurred and everything felt rushed. Here, alone, time moved in a straight line. He learned things during those hours that no one else noticed, who mumbled in their sleep, which bunk creaked every time someone rolled over. How the heater made a sharp knocking sound around 330. He grew familiar with the base's night rhythm when the security patrol passed the east gate, when the lights in the admin building flickered off, when the stray cat darted across the motor pool fence. None of it was significant, but it grounded him. The night silence reminded him of when his daughter was a baby, back when he'd take the 3 a.m. feeding shift just to give her mother a break. He used to sit in the rocking chair in the corner of their old apartment, cradling her in one arm and sipping lukewarm coffee with the other. Back then, too, it was the stillness that made him feel most alive, like he had stepped outside the blur of the world and could think clearly, without all the voices telling him who he was supposed to be. One night, as he rounded the south side of the barracks, he found Private Riley slumped against the wall, just outside the latrine, arms folded tight across his stomach. "You good?" Daniel asked quietly. Riley looked up, startled. His face was pale. "Just needed air," he muttered. "Stomach's been off." Daniel nodded. "Get back inside. I'll cover this side." Riley hesitated. "Won't you get in trouble? No one's counting minutes? Go!" Riley disappeared back into the building. Daniel stood alone again. The stars shifted slowly overhead. The cold settled into his bones. But he didn't mind. The silence wasn't empty for him. It was full of memories, of breath, of a kind of discipline that no one could shout into you. You had to find it yourself. When his shift ended and he returned to his bunk, most of the others were still deep in sleep. He peeled off his jacket, placed his boots beside his bed, and slid under the blanket without a sound. He would be up again in a few hours, doing push-ups in the mud with the rest of them. But for now, there was stillness. And in that stillness, he wasn't behind, or old, or out of place. He just was. The sergeants didn't think he could hear them, but whispers traveled differently in a hallway lined with metal lockers and boot scuffs. It was late, and most of the recruits were out on the field or passing through chow. Daniel had come back, early from gear issue, still holding the checklist in one hand. When he turned the corner and paused just before the admin office, 2 instructors leaned over a clipboard, one of them thumbing through a roster sheet. Their voices were low, but not low enough. "We'll lose him by week 4, one said. "Too slow, body's gonna give," the other chuckled. "He made it to week 2. I'll give him that." Daniel didn't move. He just stood there, out of sight, listening. There wasn't any real cruelty in their tone, more like detachment, just 2 professionals making predictions, like checking the weather. They weren't betting on his failure out of spite. They just didn't expect more. He walked past them without looking up. Neither acknowledged him, and he didn't slow his pace. Back in the barracks, the others were unwinding from the day, shirts off, boots unlaced, voices low with fatigue. He found his bunk, folded the checklist, and slid it beneath his pillow. He didn't tell anyone what he'd overheard. The thing was, he understood why they doubted him. Each morning came with new pain, the kind that lodged itself in his back and knees, then settled like rust around his joints. He was always the last one to finish laps. Every obstacle took him longer. When they did fire drills in full gear, his arms went numb halfway. Through from the weight of the pack, he didn't bounce back after rest periods. He just recovered enough to keep going, but he did keep going. By week 3, the others started noticing. Not because he got faster or stronger, but because he never missed a formation. Never asked to sit out, never asked for help. Even when his hands shook from strain, even when his boots rubbed raw patches into his heels. He lined up, focused, quiet, unshaken. It was Private Slater who said something first. "Delgado," he muttered one morning while they were lacing up, "you ever think about quitting?" Daniel shook his head. "Not once." Slater whistled softly. "That's wild, man. I think about it every day." Daniel didn't reply. just tied his second boot and stood. In week 4, they ran the hill drill again, one of the instructors. Favorites, full pack, up and down a steep slope in intervals. The third round was where people broke. The mud pulled at their boots, and the incline seemed to grow steeper with every climb. Daniel wasn't ahead, but he wasn't at the back either. Mid-pack, breathing hard, sweat burning into his eyes, but moving. One step at a time, he didn't look up toward the top, just focused on each boot, finding its place near the top. A recruit ahead of him stumbled, fell hard onto his knees. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the strap of the guy's pack and hoisted him upright. "You got this," he said simply. They reached the ridge together. From above, one of the instructors watched, arms folded, a sergeant with a clipboard. The same one who had made the bet that night, after Chow Daniel, passed him again. The sergeant didn't say anything, but their eyes met for half a second longer than necessary. No nod, no grin. Just the silent acknowledgement of a man who had stayed longer than expected. Week 4 ended on a Friday. Inspection day, uniforms pressed, boots polished. Daniel stood straight like everyone else, eyes forward, heart steady. When the sergeant called his name, it wasn't with skepticism this time, just business. One more name on the list, one more recruit who had made it to the next phase. The bet had come and gone, and Daniel was still standing. By the start of week 5, pain had become part of the routine. It wasn't the sharp kind that made you wince or yell out. It was slower, more patient. A quiet pressure that settled into joints and tendons and refused to leave. Daniel woke with it, moved with it, trained with it. He no longer tried to stretch it away. That phase had passed. The knee was first. It had been bothering him since the end of week 3, but now it swelled every night, tight and hot under the fabric of his fatigues. He iced it quietly after lights out, sitting on the edge of his bunk, careful not to let the cold pack drip onto the floor, where the sergeant making rounds might notice. He wrapped it tight before bed and tighter in the morning before PT. Then, the shoulder. It had always been a weak point, years of poor posture from desk jobs, from carrying his daughter when she was small, from sleeping wrong more times than he could count. But now it locked after certain exercises, pull-ups, overhead, lifts, gear, drills. Something inside pinched each time he raised his arm above a certain angle. There was a moment during a rifle hold drill when he couldn't lift the weapon as fast as the others, a second's delay. No one commented, but he saw the glance from Kellerman. The pain reached a point where it couldn't be ignored. During medical check one afternoon, a training medic examined the swelling in his knee and the stiff range of motion in his right arm. He pressed gently, asked questions with a tone somewhere between concern and calculation. "You're compensating," the medic said. "Favoring the leg is tightening your back and hips. If you keep going like this, it'll cascade." Daniel sat shirtless on the edge of the exam table, sweat drying on his skin. The scent of antiseptic thick in the air. The medic looked up. "We can file a request for release, not a discharge, just a pause. You'll go home, he'll come back when you're ready." Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked down at the floor, then over at the neatly arranged tray of gauze and wrap tape. He flexed his shoulder. It hurt. He bent the knee. That hurt too, but he was still breathing, still upright. "No," he said. "You sure? We've seen worse, but not often. You're not a kid anymore." Daniel met his eyes. "I didn't come here to stop halfway." The medic exhaled through his nose. "You're going to need a brace for the knee. That won't fix it, but it'll stabilize you. You'll need to ice it after every session, and that shoulder needs rest. Don't be a hero. If it seizes mid-drill that rifle's going to hit the dirt." Daniel nodded. Understood. The next morning, he showed up to formation with the brace under his fatigues. No one commented. The instructors probably already knew. Kellerman gave him a long look but said nothing. When the whistle blew, Daniel stepped forward with the rest. During drills, he moved more slowly, deliberately, but he didn't fall behind. He learned how to shift his weight differently, how to roll off the good leg, how to keep his arms lower to minimize strain. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. At night, after the others were asleep, he iced both joints in silence. The cold seeped through muscle and into bone, numbing but never relieving completely. He stared at the ceiling while it worked, breath steady, jaw clenched. Pain, he realized, was a language the body spoke to test your will. It asked questions every day, and every day he answered, not with words, but by showing up again. They offered him a way out. He had shaken his head, not because he had anything to prove, but because he hadn't come this far just to leave before the story was done. The change didn't come all at once. It wasn't a speech or a moment of heroics. It came in small, quiet shifts, hard to notice unless you were watching closely. Daniel wasn't trying to prove anything anymore, not in the way he had when he first arrived. He was too tired for that. What he did instead was keep going. Through the bruises, through the ice packs. Through the mornings where his joints felt like rusted hinges, and the nights where sleep was shallow and broken, he kept showing up. And slowly, the others began to see that. One morning before a field drill, while everyone was fumbling with packs and adjusting their vests, Private Slater walked up beside him. He held his chest strap in both hands, fingers moving awkwardly over the buckles. "I can't get this thing to sit right," Slater muttered. "Keeps pulling to one side." Daniel looked down at the gear. Without a word, he stepped closer and adjusted the right shoulder strap, pulling it snug and leveling the weight across the younger man's torso. "Try now," Daniel said. Slater rotated his shoulders, nodded. "That's better. Thanks, man." That was the first one. 2 days later, it was Private Lee, a wiry recruit with quiet eyes and blistered heels. He asked Daniel how he kept his boots from cutting into the back of his ankle. Daniel showed him the double sock method and how to fold the cuff just low enough to avoid the pinch. "You get that from a manual?" Lee asked. "No," Daniel said. "Just learned it the hard way." After that, they started coming more often. Small questions, simple things. Not because he was in charge, he wasn't, but because they saw that he answered without judgment, that he helped without hesitation, that he wasn't in a race with anyone. One afternoon, during weapons inspection, Kellerman called for the line to form tight and straight. Daniel was always last to finish cleaning his rifle, partly because his shoulder made certain movements slower, partly because he checked every part twice. He'd learned to be precise. Life had taught him that shortcuts had a cost. As he stepped into formation, he noticed his rifle strap had twisted again. Before he could fix it, Riley reached over and straightened it. "You good, Delgado?" "Yeah?" That was all they said. Later that same day, while waiting for a briefing, Slater stood across from him and asked, "You ever think about leading? Like being a squad leader?" Daniel shook his head. "That's not my job." "But they listen to you more than they listen to Kellerman," Slater said. Not joking, Daniel didn't respond. He didn't have to. The respect was there, unspoken but present. And it came not from orders or volume, but from endurance. The first time someone saluted him, it was awkward. A younger recruit, Private Dawson, mistook him for a staff sergeant as they passed in the corridor. Daniel wore his uniform neat, walked with discipline, kept his bearing even when no one was. Watching, Dawson stopped, squared up, and lifted his hand with textbook precision. Daniel blinked, caught off guard, and gave a small nod. "I'm just a recruit," he said. Dawson lowered his hand quickly, a little embarrassed. "Sorry, you just carry yourself different." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded again and walked on. That night in the barracks, while others talked about the weekend drills or the sore muscles that wouldn't go away, Daniel sat on the edge of his bunk and stretched his shoulder carefully. Slowly, he still hurt every day, but the ache had become familiar, manageable, and the silence he once carried like a shield now felt lighter. Not gone, but shared. No one said it out loud, but they had started watching him, not because of his age, not even because of what he endured, but because, in a place designed to strip everyone down to the same standard issue, he was quietly building something back up, and they saw it. The sky opened just as they lined up at the start. Thunder cracked in the distance, and a sheet of rain rolled in sideways, drenching them in seconds. The platoon shifted nervously, some squinting toward the tree line that marked the trail loop. It wasn't the first time they'd run in bad weather, but this was different. The clouds sat low, thick with static, and the mud along the path was already ankle-deep before the first step. Daniel stood near the back, adjusting his grip on the chest strap of his pack. His shoulder had been throbbing all morning, and his knee brace was starting to chafe, but he said nothing. The sergeant barked a short command, Then a whistle blew. They moved. The younger ones surged ahead immediately, splashing mud and sprinting through the first bend like it was a competition. Some shouted to each other, egging each other on, as if the rain made it more of a challenge. Daniel kept a steady pace. He knew better than to waste energy early. It wasn't about time. It was about finishing. The trail wound through a narrow, forested stretch where the rain filtered through the branches in heavy drops. Roots jutted up like traps. The mud here was slicker, pulling at boots and twisting ankles. One private ahead of him slipped and fell hard, cursing as he rolled. Daniel slowed, offered a hand, and helped him upright. The private nodded, winded, and took off again. By the second kilometer. The pack had thinned out. Some were already walking. Others had disappeared from view entirely, swallowed by the turns of the course. Daniel kept going, breath steady, arms moving rhythmically. Every few minutes, lightning would flash above the canopy, followed by the distant rumble that seemed to roll through the ground itself. At the halfway point, his knee screamed. The brace was soaked through, the compression loosened, and every step jarred upward like a spike. But he kept moving. In the clearing past the 3-kilometer mark, the mud deepened. Recruits were dragging their legs now, shoes half lost in the suction of the track. One had dropped out completely, sitting with a medic under a poncho on the side. Another limped forward with a twisted ankle, refusing to stop. Daniel passed both of them. By now, he was alone. Everyone else was ahead, some already finishing, others still pushing through the last bends. His shirt clung to his frame, soaked and heavy. The rain didn't let up. It fell harder, sideways, biting into his eyes and soaking into the tape that held his shoulder. Wrap in place, every part of him ached. But he didn't stop as he came up the final slope toward the finish post. He could see the other recruits already, gathering under the awning, towels around their shoulders, steam rising from their bodies in the cold. Some sat on benches. A few looked back toward the trail, watching. One instructor stood near the line, clipboard pressed against his chest to keep it dry. The others had gone inside, but this one stayed. Daniel's boots sank nearly to the ankle with each step, the mud pulling like glue. He leaned forward, pushing off with both legs. There was no speed left in him, only motion. Steady, determined, unbroken. He crossed the finish line alone. Dead last, no one clapped. No one cheered. They were tired, wet, and cold. But the instructor by the post nodded once. Then slowly, he lifted one hand and gave a single quiet clap. Daniel didn't look up. He simply bent forward, hands on his knees, and caught his breath. Then he straightened, walked toward the barracks. Another run finished. Another thing they thought he couldn't do. The morning started like any other, with inspection and brief announcements. Nothing in the instructor's tone hinted at what was coming. The sky was still gray from the previous night's storm, and the air carried the heavy scent of wet earth and scorched boot soles. The recruits filed into the training grounds, rifles slung over their backs, expecting another round of marksmanship drills or obstacle work. But as they waited for orders, a loud crack echoed from behind the mess hall by a plume of dense white smoke billowing into the sky. Within seconds, another smoke bomb exploded behind the barracks. Sirens began to wail, short bursts at first, then a steady scream. Lights flashed from the corners of the training yard, and a loudspeaker crackled overhead. "This is a drill. Repeat. This is a drill. Fire protocol. Evacuate." Recruits froze. Some turned toward the sound. Others looked at the instructors, unsure if it was a real emergency or just part of the day's plan. A few began moving instinctively, their training kicking in butt. It was clear from the start that most had never practiced this scenario under pressure. More smoke poured into the open spaces, obscuring vision. It wasn't just theatrical. It burned the eyes slightly, forced squinting, coughing. The drill was designed to feel real, to simulate panic, disorientation, and the pressure of rapid decisions. Daniel didn't hesitate. He didn't run. He scanned the area quickly. To the right, two recruits were circling in confusion, shouting questions over the noise. One of them dropped his gear. Another was pointing in the wrong direction, heading back toward the barracks. Daniel moved toward them, placed a hand on one shoulder, and redirected them toward the nearest exit marker. "This way, don't split up." To his left, he saw a younger Private Baker coughing violently. one hand clutching his throat, the other braced against a wall. The smoke had gotten to him. Panic was rising in his eyes. He was just a few feet from a drainage ditch and in real danger of collapsing. Daniel reached him in 3 strides. "Breathe through your shirt," Daniel said, pulling the fabric of Baker's uniform collar up over his nose. "Stay low, follow me." Baker couldn't speak, but he nodded weakly, stumbling forward. Daniel kept a hand on his arm, guiding him around the edge of a building where the smoke was thinner. In the distance, recruits were shouting over each other, some half laughing, some truly unsure. A few had tried to form lines, but no one was giving clear directions. The instructor stood back observing, not interfering. This was part of the test. Who took charge? Who froze? Daniel saw the path forming. He stepped into the clearing and called out, not with a bark or a panic, but loud and steady. "Form up here. Line to the left of the pole. Keep moving, don't bunch." A few turned, then more. They followed his voice. Someone shouted, "Who put you in charge?" "No one," Daniel said. "But you're breathing and upright, so let's keep it that way." The smoke began to thin as the last of the bombs burned out. The siren cut off the loudspeaker, clicked again. "Drill complete. Stand by for debrief." Silence settled over the grounds. Recruits stood in messy rows, shoulders heaving, eyes red. Some looked embarrassed. A few muttered complaints, but all of them were outside. No injuries, no chaos. The instructors walked through the group slowly, clipboards in hand. One of them paused near Daniel, watching him as he stepped aside from the line to help Baker sit on a concrete bench. "You've done this before?" the instructor asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, just didn't want anyone getting trampled." The instructor nodded once, then walked on. Daniel sat next to Baker for a moment, handing him a canteen. Baker took a long sip, coughed again, then looked up. "Thanks, man. I thought I was going to pass out." Daniel didn't say anything. He just sat still, hands resting on his knees, watching the last tendrils of smoke drift across the training yard. The room was smaller than he expected. No windows, one long table, 3 chairs, and a pitcher of water that no one touched. The hum of the overhead fluorescent light was steady, a low presence in the silence that followed the initial greetings. The major sat across from him, in a pressed uniform that still bore the faint creases from folding. Her sleeves were adorned with subtle insignia, and her eyes held the calm focus of someone who had read his file twice before he walked in. Daniel sat with his hands folded on the table. He had showered. He had trimmed the stubble that usually crept in during field exercises. His knee was still aching, his shoulder still stiff, but he sat upright. The major flipped open the manila folder and glanced down. "You listed no prior service," he nodded. "That's correct, age 40. You're outside the usual demographic. You waived several conditions to be here." Another nod. "You've completed basic past all requirements to this point, though with several flagged medical reviews, you never asked to speak with a counselor, despite recommendations." "I didn't feel the need," Daniel said. She looked up at him then, holding his gaze. "So, tell me, why now? Why the Army? At 40? The question wasn't new. He'd heard it whispered by recruits, muttered by instructors during stretches, joked about by others behind closed doors. But hearing it here, in this quiet room, with the door closed and no one to impress, it landed differently. Daniel leaned back slightly, not defensively, just enough to take in a breath. "I think when you're young," he said, "you make choices because you're trying to prove something to your family, to a partner, to the world, maybe even to people who aren't watching." He paused. The major didn't interrupt. "I had a job, a house, a family. I did everything you're supposed to do, clocked in, paid bills, tried to be what I thought others expected, and then it all unraveled. Slowly at first, then quickly. Marriage ended. Job gone, friends scattered." He looked down for a second, not in shame, but to find the words. "There was a night I couldn't sleep, just sitting there in the dark. And I asked myself, what's left? Who am I without the title, the keys, the name on the mailbox? I didn't have an answer." The major didn't move. The folder remained open, but untouched. So I decided to stop trying to prove things to everyone else. I didn't come here because I needed a fresh start. I came because I wanted to do something that mattered to me. Hard, real, physical. Not because anyone told me I should, but because I still could." The room remained quiet. Outside, there was no noise, no footsteps, no movement in the hallway, just the low hum of the light. The major finally closed the folder. You realize this isn't common. Your age, your background, we don't take many cases like yours. I'm not asking for common, Daniel said, just a chance to keep going. She studied him, then leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. We're reviewing roles for field assignment, instructional paths, and operation support. You're on track. But this next phase isn't about endurance. It's about judgment, communication, adaptability. Daniel nodded. You're not here to outrun the 20-year-olds anymore, she added. I never was, he said. I'm here because I finally have nothing to prove except to myself. She watched him for a moment longer, then picked up a pen and signed something at the bottom of the form. The sound of ink on paper echoed slightly in the small room. Then she stood. Thank you, Private Delgado. You'll receive your assignment within the week. He stood too, saluted Dot, and for the first time since stepping onto base weeks ago, he felt something not like pride but peace. Not loud, just settled, real. The folder was thick. Not because of misconduct or disciplinary actions, Daniel's record was clean, but because his presence alone required exceptions. Age waivers, medical reviews, background clearance, extensions. A standard recruit might generate a few pages of documentation in their first phase. His had grown into a manila brick that moved from desk to desk with a quiet, bureaucratic weight. It sat on the personnel officer's desk for 3 days. Not forgotten, just not urgent. The qualification course he'd applied for had a hard age cap 35, unless specifically approved. 40 was rarely considered. 40 meant insurance forms, physical risk, liability, projections. Not many wanted to sign their name to something outside protocol. Not unless they had to. Daniel knew all of this. He had read the policy pages himself. He had walked into the clerk's office with every form filled, every exam passed, every letter of recommendation stapled in place. Even his squad leader, once skeptical, had written a paragraph describing his consistency, his reliability, his ability to lead without ego. But paperwork moved differently when it asked questions no one wanted to answer. He checked once politely. The first time, the clerk, a specialist, barely 22, glanced at the system, still pending review. It's been routed up to Lieutenant Carver. Daniel nodded. Thank you, he returned the next day. The same answer. He waited until after morning drills. Sweat still clung to his uniform, dust lining his sleeves. His knee throbbed faintly. He entered the admin building and approached the desk again. This time, he didn't ask. He just stood there until the clerk looked up. Delgado, right? The clerk said, already clicking through screens. Daniel didn't respond. He waited. Clerk blinked, leaned back in his chair, and motioned for someone further inside. After a few minutes, Lieutenant Carver emerged from a side office, sleeves rolled and clipboard in hand. She didn't look surprised to see him. You're following up on the waiver, she said plainly. Yes, ma'am. She exhaled through her nose. It's not personal. These things take time. And truthfully, this kind of exception, age, sets a precedent. Daniel didn't react. I've read your file, she continued. You're physically within limits. You've passed all your evaluations. But you understand that the qualification course you're requesting, I understand, he said, cutting in for the first time. Not rudely, just firmly. She paused. And you still want to attempt it. I wouldn't have asked otherwise. She studied him. It's not about whether you can. It's about whether we should let you. There's a difference. I've already been in the field with them, Daniel said. I've already carried their gear, pulled their weight. No one had to carry mine. You won't get special treatment. I'm not asking for it. Her jaw tightened slightly. Then she turned back toward her office. Daniel didn't move. He waited at the desk another full 10 minutes before she returned. She handed the folder to the clerk, now with a yellow slip clipped to the front. Process it, she said. Final review stamped. The clerk nodded. Daniel stepped back. You'll be notified when you're on the roster, she said, almost as an afterthought. He didn't smile, didn't thank her, just nodded once and left. That night, as others lounged in the common area, playing cards or scrolling through their phones, Daniel sat by his bunk, adjusting the brace on his knee. A younger private nearby glanced over. Still doing that qualification thing, he asked. Daniel looked at him. Yeah, you think they'll let you? Daniel pulled the strap tighter and flexed his leg slightly. They just did. The base phone center was quiet by late evening. Most of the other recruits had already finished their calls, heading back to their bunks or crowding into the common room to talk and joke about the week's drills. A few were still seated in plastic chairs beneath the fluorescent lights, voices hushed, backs turned to give the illusion of privacy in a room that offered none. Daniel stood near the end of the row, holding the phone's cold plastic receiver against his ear. The line rang once, then again. He glanced at the wall in front of him, a cinder block surface painted beige and scuffed from years of hands, leaning, waiting, pacing. 3 rings. He shifted slightly in his stance, the knee brace pressing against his leg uncomfortably after a day of weighted runs. He'd meant to ice it earlier, but the timing never worked out. It didn't matter right now for rings. He didn't hang up. He let it ring until the automated voicemail system picked up, a generic female voice followed by a long tone. Not her. Voice, not anymore. She must have changed it. He hesitated for a second, then he spoke. "Hey, it's me." His voice sounded rougher than he expected. It had been weeks since he'd last called. Months since she had picked up. He didn't blame her. He didn't really know what he expected. "I just wanted to check in. I know you're probably busy, with school or your friends. That's okay, I get it." There was a pause. In the background, another recruit started laughing loudly into his own call, then quickly muffled himself with a hand. Daniel waited for the noise to pass. "I made it through the last phase," he continued. "Barely they're letting me attempt the qualification. Still some red tape, but it's happening. I just thought you should know." His fingers tightened slightly around the phone cord, coiled and frayed in places from long use. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to remember the sound of her laugh when she was 5, the way she used to tug at his sleeve when she wanted him to kneel down, so she could whisper something. "I know I wasn't always there. I know the divorce made everything harder. Maybe you're mad or just tired of it all. I can't fix the past, sweetheart. I wish I could." His throat felt tight, but his voice stayed level. He glanced at the clock on the far wall. 5 minutes per call, max. They monitored it closely. "I'm not calling to explain everything. I just wanted to say I'm still trying, that's all. I wake up early. I run. I carry gear that wears out my joints. And I go to bed wondering if you'd be proud of me now. Not because I'm trying to win you back, just because you matter. You always did." He took a breath, steadying himself. Another recruit walked past behind him, heading for the exit, boots squeaking slightly on the waxed floor. "I'll call again next week," he said. "Or maybe the one after, just in case." The automated system beeped, signaling that the message had ended. The line went silent. Daniel placed the receiver back on the cradle, gently. Then he stood there for another few seconds, hand resting on the edge of the phone. The buzzing hum of the overhead lights filled the space where the call had been. He stepped out into the cool night air. The sky was clear, stars visible in patches above the low buildings. He walked back toward the barracks with his hands in his pockets, passing a few others who nodded but said nothing. No reply, but he had said what he needed to say. That was enough for now. They started the week before dawn. No warning, no posted schedule, just a whistle at 0413 and boots on gravel. Within 30 minutes, every recruit was outside in full gear, lined up and blinking into the pale morning fog. Sleep still clung to their eyes, but the instructors wasted no time. They split the group into fire teams and issued the rules. This was final week. 48 hours, no structured sleep, no timeouts. Just a series of physically and mentally stacked obstacle course, forced marches, night navigation, tactical puzzles. Each event followed the last with barely a breath in between. The goal wasn't just completion, it was cohesion under pressure, awareness in exhaustion, quiet resilience in noise. The first task was a long-range movement through dense woods, carrying full packs and moving in silence. Recruits grunted under the weight. Some cursed as their boots sank in wet mud or caught under bramble. The instructors trailed behind silently, noting every shortcut taken, every complaint muttered, every unnecessary noise. Daniel fell into step in the middle of his group. He didn't lead, but he didn't lag. He adjusted his pace as the terrain changed, kept his eyes on the ground, and marked every turn by memory. His body ached, but he had long stopped expecting comfort. At one point, a recruit ahead of him tripped and stumbled into a small ditch. Daniel offered a hand without a word and moved on. By midday, they reached the obstacle course, massive, rusted sprawl of ropes, walls, bars, tunnels, and ditches. Rain from the night before made everything slick. One instructor barked the order, and they started. Some recruits hesitated at the rope climb. Others flinched at the wall jumps. Daniel took each obstacle as it came. His technique wasn't flawless, and he wasn't the fastest, but he moved with steady intent. When he reached the final stretch of crawl under netting through gravel, he heard a voice behind him mutter, "I'm done, man. I can't." He didn't look back, just muttered quietly, "Keep moving. You're almost through." The words weren't motivational, just factual, and the voice behind him kept crawling. The next challenge was night navigation. Each recruit was handed a set of coordinates and a crude map, then released into the woods with a compass and red-filtered flashlight. They had 6 hours to complete the loop. Darkness fell quickly, and the woods grew cold. Branches cracked under boots. A few recruits got turned around early, losing time. Daniel stayed quiet. He moved slowly but surely, pausing to check his bearings, often memorizing landmarks, counting paces. He hummed softly to himself an old tune he couldn't name, just a slow, quiet melody under his breath, enough to keep his focus from fraying. Hours passed. He crossed streams, climbed over fallen logs, retraced a wrong turn once, and corrected it calmly. Near the end, he spotted a figure slumped near a checkpoint marker, another recruit, breathing heavily, head in his hands. Daniel crouched beside him. "You good?" "Lost count. I've been walking in circles." Daniel pulled out his map, glanced at the markings, then looked up. "We're about 200 meters off the checkpoint." "Come on!" The recruit hesitated, then stood. They moved together, slower now, but forward. By the time they returned to camp, the sky had begun to gray with early morning light. Instructors checked names, marked completion, handed out canteens. No praise, no judgment. Just progress logged. Inside the tent, recruits collapsed wherever they could. Some on their bunks, some on the floor. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, boots still on, and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, just to rest the muscles behind his brow. Someone across the room asked quietly, "How are you still standing?" He didn't answer. He just kept humming. The rope wall stood like a monument, 20 feet of slick, knotted challenge framed by the gray sky above and churned mud below. It had rained all morning, just enough to soak the fibers and make every foothold unreliable. Recruits stared up, in silence, their boots sinking slightly in the ground as they waited for the order. Some whispered strategies to each other. Others just watched as the first few attempts ended in slips, grunts, and frustrated descents. Daniel wiped his hands on his trousers. It didn't help. Everything was wet. His gloves were soaked through from the earlier march, and his shoulder ached from where he'd clipped it on a steel rung during the night drill. But none of that mattered now. The instructor pointed at him. "Delgado, you're up." He stepped forward, adjusted his grip on the harness, and approached the base of the wall. The knotted rope hung from the top edge, swaying slightly with the wind. At the summit, a small brass bell was mounted on a wooden crossbeam. The rules were simple. Climb the wall, ring the bell, descend. No time limit, but no helping hands. Just one person, one rope, and the slope. He reached out, wrapped his fingers around the lowest knot, and pulled himself up. The first few feet were manageable. His boots found a groove in the wooden slats bolted to the wall. His arms bore the weight, and he moved steadily upward, counting knots in his head. At about halfway up, the rope shifted. A gust of wind caught him off guard, and the moisture finally did its work. His grip slipped just slightly, and with it, his foot lost contact. He slid down 3 feet before catching himself, the friction burning against his palms. He grunted not in pain, but in frustration, and hung still for a moment. From below, someone muttered, "Let it go, old man." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't look down. He simply regrouped. He adjusted his weight, swung his left leg back into position, and began climbing again at 14 feet. His shoulders screamed. The strain from the weak crawls, carries, pushes. Cold nights converged into one tight knot behind his collarbone. He stopped again, forehead pressed to the rope, eyes shut. It would have been easy to drop. No punishment for failing on the first attempt. Many already had. Some younger, faster. He could have let go, caught his breath, and waited for another chance. But he did in single quotes to instead. He whispered to himself, "One more reach." He stretched his right hand upward, found the next knot, and pulled. The rope swayed again. His boots slipped slightly, but he held another pull, another knot. Now, just 2 more. The voices below had gone quiet. Even the instructor stopped speaking. Daniel reached the top, breath shallow, arms trembling. The bell was just above his head. He let go with one hand, steadied himself with the other, and reached up. His fingers brushed the bell. It didn't move. He repositioned, stretched again. This time, he curled his hand around it and rang it once. The sound was sharp, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. He held there for a second longer, then began his descent slower, more careful. Feet feeling for footholds he couldn't see. When he hit the ground, he didn't collapse. He didn't raise his arms or look for acknowledgement. He just stepped to the side and waited for the next name to be called. One of the younger recruits leaned over, voice low. He didn't answer. The next person approached the wall. The rope still wet, the bell still ringing quietly in the wind. They didn't say it outright, not the instructors, not the recruits, but something had shifted. It wasn't in the form of applause or pats on the back. That didn't happen here, but it was in the glances, the silence that lingered when he passed, the absence of the jokes that used to follow him down the hall. In the first weeks, they had called him Old Man. Behind his back, sometimes to his face. It had been said with a smirk, a laugh, or an eye roll when he fell behind in formation runs. His age had been the punchline, the thing no one had to explain. At 40, he didn't belong. He wasn't fast, he wasn't loud, and he wasn't anyone's first pick for partner drills. But now, final week was almost over. The roster for graduation was nearly set, and he was still here. Word traveled fast in training camps, not in the form of gossip, but through observations. Someone had seen him scale the rope wall. Someone else had timed him during the navigation course. A third recruit had watched him finish the full endurance circuit with a swollen knee and no complaints. These weren't the kinds of feats that earned medals, but they stayed with people. At the chow hall, recruits who had once filled entire tables now paused and shifted to make room when he entered. Not everyone spoke, but they watched. He noticed it when one of the younger privates, the same one who used to laugh loudest, stood up and offered him the cleaner side of a bench. Even his instructors had changed their tone. Sergeant Whitaker, who once barked dismissively at every minor slip, now issued orders to him with even phrasing. No sarcasm, no hesitation. During one exercise, the sergeant even paused when choosing squad leaders. "Delgado," he said simply, "point in, you're taking Bravo team." There had been a silence after that, not disbelief, just acknowledgement. No one questioned it. Daniel didn't say anything in response. He just gave a nod and stepped forward, checking the map, issuing the route, calling for spacing. The others followed. There was a different kind of attention now, not the kind that demands approval, but the kind that comes when people begin to reassess what they thought they knew. The same recruits who had laughed in the first week now stole glances when he adjusted his gear. They asked quiet questions. "You served before?" "No." "What did you do before this?" "Something else." He didn't offer more than necessary. The details weren't important now. During the nighttime drills, 2 recruits quietly fell into step beside him. Neither said much, but they didn't stray either. One offered him half a protein bar when the rations ran light. The other passed him a clean towel when he saw him wiping down his brace with an already soaked rag. Daniel accepted but didn't comment. He didn't need to. Even the drill officers seemed to take notice during evaluations, where once they would have looked at him first for mistakes, now they lingered longer on others. When he finished the last march of the day, the instructor checking names looked him in the eye for the first time. Delgado. Good, that was all. But it was more than he'd heard since day one. When he returned to his bunk that night, the space around it was cleaner than usual. Someone had folded his shirt. Another left a bottle of sports tape on the footlocker with no note. He sat on the edge of the bed and removed his boots slowly. His hands were scraped, his arms sore. But his back was straight. Across the room, a group of recruits clustered by the heater, speaking in low tones. One of them turned his head slightly and nodded in his direction. Daniel caught it for the first time in weeks. He nodded back. No one laughed anymore. The rucksack was heavier than it had been the day before, not in actual weight, but in how it pressed into the same bruised spot on his lower back, where the frame had rubbed raw skin for 2 days straight. It was always the same angle, enough to wear down his rhythm, enough to make him shift the load every quarter mile. But Daniel didn't stop. The final march was already underway, and stopping now would mean being pulled from the roster. Each recruit carried the same weight, 45 pounds of gear, plus personal equipment, plus full canteen. The terrain wasn't forgiving. Loose gravel, on a narrow track, long inclines with no shade, a dry wind that burned instead of cooled. Dust kicked up with every step. Instructors spaced along the route said nothing, just watched. Clipboards in hand, checking forms, measuring more than distance. They had started the march before dawn. Each squad staggered in 15-minute intervals, and Daniel's group was somewhere in the middle. As always, he kept his pace even steady, not fast, but never faltering. Each step calculated, breath controlled, every movement borrowed from endurance, not speed. It wasn't about arriving first. It was about arriving without falling apart. Around mile 5, one of the younger recruits, Taylor, barely 19, tall and lean, started to slow. First, it was subtle, a step or two behind, then longer pauses at water breaks. He said he was fine. Everyone says they're fine. By mile 7, Taylor stumbled hard, the kind of stumble that didn't just throw off his pace, took him down completely. Knees in the dirt, hand barely catching his fall. His rucksack slammed into the ground beside him. Daniel didn't speak at first. No one did. The instructors weren't close enough to intervene, and Taylor didn't get up right away. Finally, Daniel stepped out of line, approached, and crouched. Beside him, "You done?" he asked. Taylor didn't answer, but the shaking in his shoulders gave it away. His breath came in short bursts, eyes red. He wasn't injured, just done. Daniel looked at the rucksack, then at the horizon. They still had several miles to go, and no one else was moving to help. He reached down, loosened the straps on Taylor's bag, and slung it over his own, adjusting for balance. His body protested instantly. 45 became 90. The extra weight pulled him sideways. He reset. His footing readjusted the straps and told Taylor, "Fall in at the back. Just walk." Taylor nodded, dazed, and started again, slower, without the pack. Daniel rejoined the formation. No one said a word. They simply made space. With every step, the second pack shifted against him, the frame knocking his ribs, the bulk throwing off. His gait, his knees screamed, his shoulders burned. The blisters on his left foot had split open again, wet inside the boot. But he didn't stop. Each mile passed like a test, not of strength, not even of endurance, but of something quieter, refusal to fail even when no one was watching, a quiet demand placed only on himself. By mile 10, his shirt was soaked through, his head pounded. But the finish point came into view, just a flagged marker at the base of a hill where 2 instructors waited, timers in hand. Daniel crossed the line carrying both bags. He didn't drop them. He waited until Taylor crossed behind him. Then, only then, did he ease the second rucksack off his back and set it down beside the recruit. Gently, deliberately. One of the instructors raised an eyebrow. "You carried both." Daniel didn't answer. He just stood there, breath steadying, as the others crossed in silence behind him, and no one laughed. Not anymore. The air at the end of the march was still, heavy with the kind of quiet that settles after long exertion. Dust hung in the sunlight, drifting lazily over the hill where the finish line had been marked with 2 faded red flags and a battered wooden sign staked into the ground. A few recruits had already crossed and were sitting on their packs, sipping from canteens in silence. No one talked, no one celebrated. Everyone was waiting for the clock to run down. Daniel stood off to the side, his knees stiff, both palms resting on the top of his rucksack. His boots were caked with dried mud from a creek crossing hours earlier. His shirt clung to his back, soaked and dust-streaked. The pain in his shoulders was sharp, localized, like a thin blade between the bones. But he kept standing. He wasn't watching the clock. He wasn't looking for anything. He was just there, the final steps of the march. Hadn't felt like a finish. There had been no ceremony, no music, just the sound of gravel under boots and a name called from a clipboard. But the instructors knew what had happened. They had watched even if they hadn't said anything. One of them, Master Sergeant Lennox, approached. From the field tent near the tree line, older, maybe in his 50s, built like a brick wall with a voice that usually made people flinch. He carried no clipboard this time, no gear, just his cap tucked under one arm. He walked directly toward Daniel. The other recruits noticed. One nudged another. Still, no one spoke. Lennox stopped in front of him, not too close, just enough that the space between them held weight. For a long moment, the sergeant didn't say anything. His eyes scanned Daniel-faced uniform, hands, knees, then settled on his eyes. He didn't look away. Daniel straightened instinctively. He didn't salute. He hadn't been addressed. Then Lennox did something unexpected, something none of the others had seen during the entirety of training. He raised his hand. A sharp, deliberate salute, full extension. No rush, no expression on his face. Daniel didn't blink. He returned it, not quickly, not dramatically, just with the same weight, and then, just as quietly, Lennox dropped his arm, nodded once, and turned around. He walked away without a word. Daniel stood there for a while longer. The dust still hung in the air. The sun still burned above them, but the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. From behind him, a voice murmured, "Did he just—" Another recruit whispered, "Yeah, that was it." No speech, no announcement, just one of the hardest instructors in the battalion, walking up to a man twice the age of everyone, Elson saluting. Daniel adjusted the strap on his rucksack and turned toward the shaded side of the clearing. He found a spot near the fence line, away from the crowd, and sat down slowly, stretching his legs out in front of him. He rolled his ankle in a circle. It clicked twice. The ache was settling in deeper now, the kind that came after adrenaline left the body. Someone walked past and offered a bottle of water. He accepted it with a nod. Later, there would be evaluations, maybe a formal review. But in that moment, there was nothing more to prove. A man who came in with nothing, no letters, no visits, no expectations, had reached the end. Still standing, still silent, and now they were watching him. The chow hall wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet either. Boots echoed on the concrete floor, trays clattered onto metal rails, and the low murmur of tired voices filled the space like background static. Rows of long tables stretched across the room, each one lined with young faces, some still red from the sun, others pale from exhaustion. Recruits filed through in the same mechanical rhythm as always, eyes scanning for empty seats, for familiar faces, for anywhere they wouldn't be noticed too much. Daniel moved like he always did. Tray in hand, he passed down the line. Same portions as the others, dry chicken, watery vegetables, a small square of cornbread that had seen better days. He didn't complain. He never had. He nodded once at the server, took a cup of water, and turned toward the corner table by the wall, the same one he'd sat at for weeks now. It was a quiet spot, one where no one ever sat beside him, unless there was absolutely no other choice. In the early days, it had been the unspoken arrangement, let the old guy have his space. No one said it, but everyone understood it. He didn't mind. Silence was easier than explaining himself, but this time, as he approached the table and set down his tray, someone followed. "Hey, Delgado, mind if I sit with you?" The voice came from just behind him, calm, casual, but clear. Daniel turned slightly. It was Perez, one of the younger recruits, barely 20, always fast on the drills, loud in the locker room, the kind of energy that bounced off walls. He wasn't the worst of them, but he hadn't said much to Daniel before, not beyond a nod or a side glance. Daniel gestured to the spot across from him. "Sure." Perez sat down. He didn't rush into conversation, just adjusted his tray, poked at the green beans with his fork, and let the moment settle. Others noticed, from a few tables over, 2 more recruits glanced their way. One nudged another. No one got up, but the glances kept coming. "Didn't think you'd still be here," Perez said after a few bites. "Thought maybe you'd disappear after the march." Daniel shrugged. "Still got a few days left." Perez nodded. "That was something what you did for Taylor." Daniel didn't answer. Another voice joined them, this time from behind. "Hey, is this seat taken?" It was Kim, the squad leader from week 2. Keep pace during a drill. He had, quietly. Daniel shook his head. "Go ahead." She slid in next to Perez without another word. It kept happening, slowly, one by one. Not a crowd, not all at once, but a shift. A few minutes later, Taylor himself walked over, his ankle still taped from the march. "Hey, thanks again," he said, his voice low. For that, Daniel just nodded. He didn't need more. The table filled. Conversations didn't revolve around him. They weren't about medals or stories. Just the usual talk. Who had blistered, who was struggling with sleep, who had lost. A sock in the laundry rotation again. But they spoke with him now, not around him. The tray beside him was no longer the only one on the table. When Sergeant Whitaker entered the room from the far door, he paused at the sight of them, just briefly, then continued through the hall, clipboard under one arm. No comment. But his eyes lingered a second longer than usual. Daniel didn't notice. He was watching Perez describe a ridiculous moment from the previous night's barracks cleanup, a trash bag that split, water bottles everywhere, someone slipping on soap, and swearing loudly. People laughed, including Daniel. Not loud, just enough. "So, Delgado, you ever think about going officer route?" He looked up, surprised. Not because of the question, but because of the way it was asked. Not old man, not him, just his name, spoken like he belonged. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up his cup, took a slow drink of water, and finally said, "I haven't ruled anything out." The morning began with the sound of boots on gravel. Rows of recruits filed into formation in front of the flagpole. Uniforms pressed, collars straight, boots polished just enough to reflect the pale light of early dawn. A faint wind moved through the field, lifting dust and shifting the edge of the American flag just enough to make the fabric whisper. The instructors stood at the front, clipboards in hand, caps pulled low, eyes sweeping across the crowd with quiet calculation. Daniel stood in the third row, fourth from the left, same place he always ended up. No one had assigned spots, but patterns formed early. He hadn't thought much of it until now. His uniform felt tighter than usual, not from size, but from the weight of the moment. The patch ceremony wasn't for decoration. It meant something. It marked transition, completion. A line crossed, no guarantees beyond it, but a signal that you'd made it this far. The air was heavy with anticipation. No music played, no speeches were made. Just a short command from the lead instructor and a call for silence. Then the names began. One by one, recruits stepped forward as their names echoed from the clipboard. Each received a handshake, a nod, and the small rectangular patch placed carefully into their waiting palm. No applause, no cheering. This wasn't graduation. It wasn't over. But it was something. Daniel listened as the names moved down the list. Perez, Kim, Taylor, others. He'd trained beside, struggled with, sometimes stood guard next to in complete silence. Then the pause, not long, just enough. Delgado, the voice didn't need to shout. The name carried clearly over the open field. Daniel stepped forward. No hesitation. His boots struck the ground in even measured steps. He kept his posture straight, chin level, eyes forward. It wasn't pride that filled his chest, it was something quieter, something earned. He reached the front line and stopped. Master Sergeant Lennox stood waiting, same clipped stance, same unreadable expression. He held the patch in one hand, steady, fingers curled around it like it was made of something heavier than cloth. Lennox didn't say anything. He just extended the patch. Daniel accepted it without ceremony, just a quiet exchange, hand to hand. And then, for the first time, Lennox's voice dropped into something less formal. "Earned," he said simply. Daniel gave a slight nod. No smile, just the acknowledgement. He turned and walked back to formation. And as he did, something shifted, not in the air, not in the sky, but in the posture of the recruits standing in the rows he passed. Heads straightened, eyes met his. A few gave imperceptible nods. Taylor offered a subtle thumbs up, half hidden by the line of his body. Perez gave a faint smirk that didn't mock. Daniel stood in line again. Patch now in his breast pocket, he didn't touch it. He didn't have to. Behind the rows, a photographer snapped a photo just once. It would go in a file somewhere, maybe. a yearbook of sorts. Most wouldn't see it, but Daniel would be there, captured in uniform, standing tall, no longer in the shadow of mockery or doubt. After the ceremony ended, the recruits were dismissed. Some wandered to the edge of the field, others grouped by the water station. Daniel stayed where he was for a moment, letting the space empty around him. The patch stayed in his pocket, not yet sewn on, but already part of him. No applause, no cheering, just the quiet sense that, for the first time in a long while, he had stood in front of everyone and hadn't been laughed at. He wasn't expecting mail that day. The bin in the hallway was always filled with the usual folded base newsletters, dental appointment slips, forgotten flyers for workshops or holiday rotations. Most recruits passed it without even glancing. Mail call had become routine, impersonal, something that didn't belong to him. The others had families who wrote weekly. They passed around care packages, shared snacks from home, read letters out loud, or tucked them into uniform sleeves like talismans. Daniel never received any of that until that morning. The stack was thinner than usual, just a handful of envelopes fanned out over the table near the admin window. Daniel wasn't looking for anything in particular, just stopped by habit. Then his eye caught it. Tucked between two pre-printed notices was an envelope that didn't match the rest. No typed label, no government seal, just a small, hand-addressed rectangle with uneven corners and faded blue ink. His name was written in Cursive, Daniel Delgado. The handwriting was tight, a little shaky. There was no return address, just his name, his unit, and the base location, scrawled in the middle. He picked it up slowly, unsure if it had been placed there by mistake, but it hadn't. He turned it over once, checking the back for any clue. Nothing, just a small fold of tape securing the flap. He stepped outside the building before opening it, away from the buzz of voices and the scraping of chairs across tile floors. The sun was just beginning to rise higher, casting long shadows against the concrete walkway. A few recruits walked past without noticing him. Daniel stood still, holding the envelope for a moment longer. Then he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no decoration, no lined notebook paper, just a simple white page with 7 words written in the same uneven hand. "I'm proud of you, Dad. Keep going." That was it. No signature, no date, no explanation, but he knew the handwriting. It had changed since 3rd grade spelling tests and messy refrigerator drawings, but not enough to be unrecognizable. He could still see the old loops in the Y, the slight right lean in the G, the way the P dipped too low into the margin. It was her. He stood there for a long time. The letter held lightly between his fingers, the words already memorized. The paper was ordinary. The ink was smudged slightly at the bottom, maybe from a hesitation, maybe from moisture. But the message 7 quiet words struck harder than anything that had happened during training. He hadn't heard from her since before the enlistment. No call after the final court date. No response to the voicemail he'd left from the barracks, just to say he was trying. He hadn't expected anything. She was young. Teenagers had their own gravity, pulled by friends, noise, distraction, and he had left during the mess of it, all papers signed, rooms emptied, promises broken by silence. But now, this dot, he folded the letter once and slipped it back into the envelope. He didn't tell anyone about it, not at breakfast, not during drills, not even when Perez asked if he looked a little taller today. Maybe he did. Later that night, when the dorm lights dimmed and the voices softened to murmurs across the bunks, Daniel sat on the edge of his cot. The letter rested beside him, tucked inside his journal. He didn't reread it. He didn't need to. For weeks he'd pushed through with no hand on his back, no voice cheering from the sidelines. Just a quiet promise to himself that he wouldn't quit. That he'd finish, for once, not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove something deeper to himself. Now, with a single envelope and a single sentence, the silence had shifted. He wasn't invisible anymore. Not to everyone, not to her. And that made the weight of the coming days just a little easier to carry. The orders came in a manila envelope, like everything else on base. No ceremony, no explanation beyond a few lines of typed text clipped to a larger form. Recruits lined up to receive theirs, some trying to peek ahead, others too nervous to look. Daniel waited his turn, hands behind his back, standing in the shade outside the administrative building. When his name was called, he stepped forward, took the envelope, and nodded without a word. He didn't open it right away. There was something about moments like these that called for space-quiet, uninterrupted time to let the reality of it settle. He walked down past the barracks, turned into the empty common area, and sat on a bench near the edge of the drill field. The sun had started to tilt lower, casting long streaks of gold over the gravel. A light breeze stirred the edges of the paper as he finally peeled the flap open. It wasn't what he expected. While most recruits would rotate into standard unit assignments, some into infantry, some into logistics, others into technical roles, his orders were different. He'd been selected for mentorship training. The role wasn't combat-heavy. It wasn't glamorous. It meant staying on base a while longer, undergoing an additional round of instruction, and eventually becoming part of the team responsible for shaping incoming recruits. He read the words again. Mentorship program, candidate. Leadership evaluation recommended. Probationary role pending review. He looked up from the page, eyebrows slightly raised. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't lobbied, hadn't even considered it as a possibility. Yet here, it was an invitation to step not just forward, but sideways, into something entirely different. A week earlier, he'd helped a recruit with a jammed strap on their pack. The week before that, he'd volunteered to walk a younger teammate to the infirmary after a heat incident. He hadn't thought anything of it. These were the kinds of small actions that filled the days, quiet decisions, invisible unless someone was watching closely. Apparently, someone had been. He looked back at the page and realized something else. There were only 2 other names listed in this assignment group. Both were younger. One was from his squad, the other he barely recognized. But none of them were called out as exceptional, just suitable, observed, capable of setting a tone. He folded the paper, slipped it back into the envelope, and held it in his lap. It didn't feel like a reward. It felt like a responsibility. That evening, as the recruits gathered for dinner, Daniel sat at the far end of the table. Not alone this time. Perez dropped into the seat across from him and eyed him with mock suspicion. "You look like someone who got good news," he said. Daniel didn't answer right away. Then, assignment orders came in. Perez raised an eyebrow. "Infantry, mentorship." Trek Perez blinked. "Seriously?" Daniel nodded once. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Perez laughed quietly, nodded him, but almost in disbelief. "Figures. You're the guy half of us asked for help when no one else was looking." Daniel didn't reply, but the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Later that night, he stood outside the barracks alone. The sky above was clear. The stars felt closer than usual. He hadn't come here to teach. That was never the goal, but maybe the path had found him anyway. He thought about the recruits just arriving this week. Fresh uniforms, nervous eyes, some already carrying more than they let on. Maybe a few of them would find their way through, like he had. Just a little steadier for having someone next to them who didn't flinch. He watched the lights across the field blink out, one by one. Then he went inside, already preparing for the next phase. The grocery store hadn't changed. Same cracked tiles near the freezer section, same flickering bulb above the checkout lane. Daniel didn't come often, just when leave allowed, and even then, he moved quietly through his hometown, like someone passing through borrowed time. He had his list folded in his back pocket, eggs, bread, coffee, nothing sentimental. He was halfway through the aisle with the canned goods when he heard a familiar voice calling out prices over the intercom. Someone from school, maybe, or someone who just never left. He didn't stop walking. His duffel bag sat heavy in the cart, pressed against neatly folded clothes and a sealed box of books he planned to mail later. He wore his uniform because he hadn't planned to change. The beige-issued jacket still zipped, name tag clean. Boots marked with dust from the drive. He turned the corner near the produce and reached for a bag of apples. When he heard her voice, "Daniel," it wasn't loud. Barely more than a question caught in the air, but he recognized it immediately. He turned slowly. She was standing near the oranges, a basket looped on her arm, hand frozen mid-reach. Her hair was pulled back in a way that made her look exactly the same and entirely different. No ring, just a bracelet he remembered giving her years ago that now looked like it belonged to someone else. For a second, neither of them spoke then. She took a step closer, eyes fixed on the patch above his chest. "You really did it," she said, quieter this time. He didn't smile, he didn't frown. He just nodded once. "Didn't think you would," she added. He looked down briefly, adjusted the edge of the cart handle. "A lot of people didn't." There wasn't bitterness in his voice, just fact. She looked like she wanted to say more. Her hand tightened on the basket handle, knuckles showing faint white beneath her skin. "I saw something online. Training. Photos, maybe. Thought it might have been you," she said, "but I wasn't sure." He didn't answer right away. Just shifted his weight slightly and waited. "I guess I didn't think you'd change." Daniel studied her face. It was familiar in every detail, but distant in the way people become when you stop sharing life with them. He remembered arguments over bills, the sound of keys tossed on the kitchen table, her silence at the final mediation meeting, the way she couldn't look at him when the papers were signed. "I didn't change," he said finally. "I just stopped waiting." She blinked, caught off guard by the response. He saw her eyes flicker down to the insignia on his jacket, the tag with his name. She reached for something else to say, but didn't quite find it. "How's she doing?" he asked. It took her a moment to realize he meant their daughter. "She's okay," she replied. "Busy school stuff." He nodded once. No expectation, just information. "I think she saw your photo too," she added, almost as if it hurt to admit. She didn't say much, just kept scrolling. Daniel didn't react. He already knew. The silence too well. "I should go," she said. Adjusting the basket again, he stepped aside slightly, letting her pass. She took one step, then paused again. "You look strong," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. Daniel didn't thank her. He didn't need to. He simply replied, "I am," and that was enough. She walked away, and he returned to the apples, picked up a bag, checked the skin for bruises, dropped it into the cart. As he rolled down the aisle, a toddler in another cart pointed at his boots and whispered something to his mother. The woman smiled and nodded politely. Daniel nodded back. He didn't need recognition or approval. Or apologies. The uniform wasn't for them. It was for the man who decided quietly, without permission, that he wouldn't live the rest of his life waiting for someone else to define him. The announcement came 2 days before the ceremony. A plain clipboard passed around in the rec hall, asking for volunteers or nominations. Most glanced at it and moved on. A few joked about what they'd say if given the mic. No one wanted the pressure of speaking in front of brass, recruits, and families. It was supposed to be a celebration, not a test. When Daniel's name appeared at the bottom of the list knot, in his own handwriting, he said nothing, just stared at the neat print. Someone else had added and moved on. That evening, an instructor approached him quietly outside the barracks. "It's not a performance," the man said, arms folded. "They just want someone who's been through it to say something real." Daniel nodded once. "I'm not good with speeches." "You don't need to be," the instructor said. "You just need to be honest." That night, he sat alone in the quiet corner of the mess hall. Others played cards, packed bags, ironed uniforms. He took a piece of lined paper and a pen from his locker and wrote down 3 sentences. That was all. He folded the paper and slid it into his pocket. The morning of graduation, the base was transformed. Flags lined the walkway. Rows of folding chairs filled the training field. Families began arriving early, carrying cameras and signs, some holding back tears before the ceremony even started. There were children holding stuffed animals, parents adjusting ties, grandparents standing with canes and plastic water bottles. In hand, Daniel stood at attention in the front row of his platoon. His uniform was crisp, boots shined, the sun reflected faintly off the emblem at his shoulder. Behind him, younger recruits whispered nervously. He could hear someone a few rows back practicing a speech under their breath. He didn't speak, didn't look around. The podium was simple. Nothing elaborate, just a microphone, a paperweight, and a small wooden stage. He didn't bring the paper from his pocket. He looked out across the crowd. At the sea of strangers and a few familiar faces, no sign of his daughter. He hadn't expected her to come. But he wasn't scanning the crowd for her either. He placed both hands on the podium and spoke without a script. "I don't like speeches," he said, voice steady. "But I want to say this." There was a pause. "You're not too old. You're just not done yet." That was it. He stepped back. The audience was quiet for a moment, unsure if he'd finished. Then applause. Not loud, not explosive, but warm, real. He returned to his place in formation. Later, after the ceremony, a younger recruit came up to him while others were taking pictures and hugging family members. "Hey," the kid said, awkwardly holding his cap in both hands. "That thing you said about not being done." Daniel looked at him. "Thanks," the kid added. "I needed that." Daniel nodded once, and the recruit jogged back toward a cluster of classmates. He stood off to the side for a while longer, hands in his pockets, the breeze tugging lightly at the flag overhead. An officer passed by and gave him a nod of approval. A civilian approached him with a firm handshake and asked which company he'd been assigned to. He answered politely but briefly. Eventually, the crowd thinned. Uniforms disappeared behind. Parked cars, folding chairs began to clatter into stacks. The moment passed, just like every other dot. Daniel walked back toward the barracks slowly, the same lined paper still folded in his pocket unused. He never needed to read it out loud because what he said, what he lived, was already enough. The sun had dipped low enough to cast the base in a wash of soft amber. Most of the day's activity had slowed. Recruits were in the mess hall, others finishing up final tasks before leave, some packed and ready to head home for the first time. In months, the track sat mostly empty now, marked by fading white lines and surrounded by a quiet stretch of fence. Daniel stepped onto it without fanfare. No stopwatch, no cheering squad, no clipboard-wielding instructors, just him, the gravel, beneath his boots, and the evening air cooling against his skin. He wore no rank insignia today, just his training, gear clean, functional and broken in from months of wear. His knees ached a little, as they always did near nightfall. There was a stiffness in his back that hadn't quite gone away since the rope wall, but nothing sharp, nothing unmanageable. He started with a walk, slow and even, like he'd done in the early weeks before his body had adjusted, back when every joint protested and his breath came too fast. Now he didn't need to think about the pace. It came naturally. As he picked up speed, his arms fell into rhythm with his stride. The track circled him in a comforting loop. No surprises, no corners, just forward and then forward again. The first lap passed in near silence, save for the crunch of soles on gravel and the soft exhale of breath every few strides. On the second lap, his muscles loosened. The stiffness melted, replaced by the quiet burn of endurance. He didn't run for time. He wasn't trying to prove anything not anymore. This wasn't for qualification. This wasn't for anyone else. It was just one more lap, halfway through. He heard faint voices on the far side of the field, two recruits tossing a football, laughing, carefree. He nodded at them as he passed. One of them waved. Neither interrupted him. On his third lap, he let his mind drift out to the day he'd walked into the recruiting office, unsure of whether they'd laugh him out the door, to the mornings when every part of his body had screamed to stop, to the first time he'd been called sir by someone younger, not out of formality, but respect, to the letter in his drawer, still unread, still treasured. He remembered the silence of the nights, when he had no visitors, no calls, no one cheering him on, and how he had kept moving anyway, through each drill, each test, each moment of doubt. By the fourth lap, the sky had turned purple, and the track lights buzzed to life one by one. The field emptied behind him, the mess hall doors clanked shut. A breeze rolled across the open yard, stirring dust and memory alike. His pace slowed not out of exhaustion, but because he wanted the moment to last. At the final bend, he spotted someone sitting on the edge of the bleachers. One of the new recruits, a girl who'd just started her first week. She watched him quietly, elbows on her knees, water bottle dangling loosely from one hand. He finished the lap and didn't stop. He just started another. The rhythm stayed easy, the path familiar, his breath steady. It was the kind of run he never thought he'd make months ago, not because he couldn't, but because he'd convinced himself he wasn't built for it. Not at his age, not with his record, not with the life he'd left behind. Now he knew better. Not every win came with applause. Not every finish line had a banner. Some just looked like this: a quiet evening, an empty track, and the decision to keep moving, even when no one was watching, just because he could. The recruit couldn't have been more than 18, barely filled out his uniform, his name tag still stiffed at the edges like it hadn't been washed yet. He stood at the far end of the gear tent, fumbling with the buckle on his vest, jaw clenched, eyes darting toward the others around him, trying not to look lost. Failing. Daniel noticed him early that morning, lingering at the back of every formation, always a step behind. He wasn't weak, just unsure. The kind of quiet most people mistook for disinterest, but Daniel recognized it. That look of someone weighing every breath before taking it. It was the same look he'd worn on his own first day. Later, after the drills, when the sun had settled low and the base cooled to a manageable heat, Daniel found himself near the training yards benches. His water bottle sat untouched beside him. He wasn't waiting for anything in particular, just letting the day bleed out. Slow, the young recruit approached cautiously. Hands in his pockets, gaze uncertain. "Excuse me, sir." Daniel looked up. "You don't have to call me sir. I work for a living." The kid gave a faint smile. "Sorry, He paused. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel nodded. There was a beat of silence. Then the recruit spoke. "Did you ever think you were too old to start?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked out over the yard, where a few others were still cooling down from the last run. Dust lifted lazily in the breeze. Boots scuffed the dirt. The smell of fabric and effort hung in the air. Then he turned back to the kid. "Every single day." The recruit blinked, clearly expecting something more reassuring. Daniel continued, "That's why I kept going." The boy looked confused. "I don't get it." "You think being unsure means you're not supposed to be here," Daniel said, adjusting his posture, "but feeling like you're too old, too slow, too late. That just means you're about to do something hard. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it." The kid lowered his gaze. "I don't know if I'll make it." Daniel shrugged. "Neither did I." He leaned forward slightly, arms resting on his knees. "I had a family once, a house, a job. Lost all of it. Came here with nothing but a stubborn idea I couldn't shake. And most people laughed. Some still do." The recruit nodded slowly. "But there's something about hitting bottom that teaches you how to stand," Daniel added. "You don't climb back the same way. You find other ways." They sat there in the quiet for a moment. The recruit finally asked, "Was it worth it?" Daniel looked him in the eye. "I don't think about worth like I used to. This isn't about medals or pride. It's about showing up, one morning at a time." The boy looked down at his boots, then back up. "Thanks," he said. Daniel stood, stretched slightly, then turned to leave before walking off. He glanced back. "You'll ask yourself that same question tomorrow," he said, "and the day after. That's how you know you're growing." The kid nodded again, this time with something steadier in his face. Less doubt, not gone, but smaller. Daniel walked away, toward the barracks, the evening light catching the edges of his silhouette behind him. The young recruit stayed seated on the bench for a while, hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing in particular. He wouldn't know it yet, but that moment, quiet, unglamorous, barely noticeable, was one he'd carry long after training. And he'd remember the answer. Every day, that's why I kept going.